Last time we talked about nationalism and the rise of democracy, democratic revolutions. There was actually an extensive period in between that moment and when the Industrial Revolution started to really impact things. We're going to look at that period as the sort of quintessential moment in the rise of modernity. Through the period of colonialism, basically, over the early modern period, we had a system of mercantilism in place. Mercantilism is where governments regulate economic activity so that their exports exceed their imports. And this was how you built the royal coffers. You would place high tariffs on incoming imports and goods that were brought into your country to make them more expensive so that people would buy your home products. And then you would try to export to make money on your exports. The royal house, the king or the queen, would give charters to certain businesses to, run a particular business. There's a little town of Coulier, France, that I went to where they had the royal charter to fish anchovies. And so they'd bring tons and tons of anchovies into this little town. And they had a charter to do this on behalf of the king to make king money, or the queen money. And to this day, our major corporations are chartered in the same way. But it's these charter organizations that start to turn into what we think of as modern capitalism, right? So these state-sponsored, chartered sort of companies started to really expand in the colonial context. You get the Dutch East India Company. There was an English East India Company. The Hudson Bay Company, for example, was charged with exploiting the resource of the Hudson Bay River. The Massachusetts Bay Colony, the Mississippi Charter was another one. And these were actual charters from the various sovereigns to exploit these regions. And they were speculative ventures. Nobody knew what they would find in the Hudson Bay, or nobody knew what they would find in the Mississippi region. But we started to develop and control these supplier and consumer markets. The finance houses that would have to invest in these ships, the trading, the ports, this was all expensive and very risky business. So the finance mechanisms, the insurance mechanisms, the infrastructure in the transport and harbors, those all had to be developed in order to exploit these colonial holdings. The lands, the natural resources, the agricultural output, the raw materials, whether it be coal or eventually oil or diamonds or whatever it happened to be. We've talked about cotton and various rubber, other sort of commodities that would be produced, and also the labor of the people in those regions, whether they were the indigenous population or oftentimes slave labor moved into the region. But it's about effectively exploiting these colonial resources on behalf of the king, right? Well, in Northern Europe, the Industrial Revolution sort of began to take off. And in the beginning, it was water wheels. They were using water power to drive, the old style water wheels, to drive looms that could create more textiles. Eventually, this would be replaced by the steam engine, right? But in the first breath of this Industrial Revolution, it looked really a lot more like an agricultural revolution, and that's what we called it. It was about the science of doing farming and rotating crops and fertilizing and seed sowers, and you get the Jethro Tull invention and the cotton gin. And so the early pieces of this revolution were about increasing the food supply and feeding people. And this increased the population of Europe and started to create that surplus that made Europe wealthy. This is how we get the wealthy capitals of Europe. Europe became, wealthier in and of its own, but part of what was happening is that the colonial trade and the resources that were coming in from the colonies made more resources available than the English population could handle. You had really resources from India, from around the world. And so we had to develop mechanisms for manufacturing that could take advantage of this incredible explosion in the availability of raw materials and also cheap labor. So what we're looking at are mechanisms that go into place to exploit that. It's already developing down this line when steam power gets invented. Steam power driven by coal really changes things dramatically. All of a sudden we have this seemingly unending supply of extraordinary power at our hands. And this increased the demand for Northern European and British goods in terms of textiles and cotton and the slavery that was required supposedly to grow the cotton and to mine the coal and create the steel and produce all of these textiles. So you're talking about a sort of a really aggressive machine that could turn these resources into profit. This is, what was driving this transition that we're talking about. This becomes a turning point in the history of the world. It changes where we work, where we live, how we work, and in some cases, the definition of what even working means. And I'll get into that. We used to manufacture clothing, for example, piecemeal in the home. They would parcel out the cloth to various people, and there was a whole, cottage industry, we still use that term today, in sewing clothing piecemeal out there, in all the little villages and things. Work would have been done in the home, in the village. We had your blacksmith and your coppersmith and your silversmith. Why so many people are named Smith, right? You had to have a baker. Why so many people named Baker? There you go. The candlestick maker, the tinker, the tailor, the porter, the potter. That's where we get all of these names from. Through the medieval period, I would have been known as Phil the blacksmith, for example, and eventually that name would be cut to Smith or Cartwright or any number of other names. They didn't have use for last names, and so everybody would end up being called, Susie of whatever, Northshire, because that would become their name, because that's all they needed to have in a small village was first names. And so place names and occupation names become the vast majority of our family names, throughout the medieval period. And then you switch over into German and it becomes Schumacher instead of shoemaker, right? And then you do it all again in French and Italian, and they're really all the same names. This revolution takes work out of the home. What happens is you build a big steam engine which is super heavy. They are not lightweight. This is why we never had steam engine cars that were very effective, or why there's no steam engine airplane, right? Super big, heavy machines. And you had to bring the work to the machine, right? And so you were pulling people off the farm, out of their agricultural lifestyle, and bringing them to the steam engine. You built a shed over your steam engine, and you have a factory, right? And so you're pulling people off the land. At the same time, the lands, the communal grazing lands, that's all being privatized or enclosed. And so people are being actively pushed off the land and into the new factory towns at the same time. This is when we become urban. Before this moment, like 90% of the population of the world lived on farms and in small villages, right? So these power-driven machines started to replace a lot of what was handwork or craftsmanship, we would have called it. We start to see mass-produced products at this time. And so this whole way of life then develops as the best way of bringing workers into the factory. The workers would work in the factory 60, 70, 80 hours a week. There was no such thing as a 40-hour work week. There was no weekends. And they wouldn't necessarily go all the way home to their farm ground. What they would do is they'd build shanty towns right outside of the factory. And you'd work a 16-hour day, and then you would go and, crash at your little shanty right outside the factory. So factories and slums or shanty towns start to develop together. You might go home to see your ancestral lands on the weekend and visit grandma and grandpa. But basically, this urbanization process develops out of industrialization. And the thing about the Industrial Revolution is that in its first blush, it's incredibly powerful. This is the moment in history, the first time in history, where we can create enough clothing to actually clothe everyone. You can actually put shoes on everyone's feet, and you can technically feed everyone. This is an amazing turn in history. And this productive power, and you see the steam engines in the background, the Gutenberg press is part of this, but the wealth, the bounty that steam and industrialization could produce was amazing. There's like a tenfold increase in human productivity. And what we see in, for example, Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations, and these ideas are actually much older than this, but Adam Smith sort of brings it all together and popularizes ideas, these economic ideas, and makes them accessible to the general public, right? And what he says is, gives the example of the pins. And I'm just going to throw some numbers at you. But let's say you're making those little pins they use in sewing. And what they do is they take a piece of wire, and you cut the wire, and you have to sharpen one point and make it a pin point. And then on the other end, you got to put the little cap on there, and then you line them up in those little paper holders. So you have like 10 pins in a little paper holder, and that's how they used to sell them in the dime store. Anyone seen pins arranged this way? You guys don't sew anymore, right? We just wear clothes and out it goes. About 40% of the clothing we buy ends up in the trash without ever really being worn. But, Adam Smith was arguing that a person on their own might be able to make 10 pens an hour. But if you rearranged the labor and divided up the labor so that one person's cutting the wire and one person's sharpening the points and another person's putting on the little pin head and another person's doing this, you could create 100 pens an hour per person. And this assembly line division of labor was a tenfold increase in the productive power of humans. And particularly when you start to pair it with steam power, water power or steam power, then it would magnify it even more. And this is where we start to get into specialization. Before this, right up into the 1800s, a car maker would make an entire car from start to finish. This was a craftsperson they're called cars because carriage. These are, motor-driven carriages instead of horse-driven carriages, where a car comes from. But the old carriage makers would start to make these motor-driven carriages, and they would have to know how to do the wheels and the suspension and the motor and the carriage, structure itself. And they would hand build these things start to finish. And you had to be a real expert at the whole thing. And when you built these carriages originally, the right wheel was fitted to the right axle, and it wouldn't necessarily fit on the left axle. The parts were not interchangeable. In this sort of system, you're just creating each item individually, and everything's custom fit. So you can't take the back wheels and put them on the front wheels or anything. If it broke down, it had to go back to the original artisan that made it. So somebody else is not going to be able to fix this thing. So along comes the division of labor and the production line, the assembly line that we think about it. And all of a sudden you have this incredible productive power at your disposal. And this is what Adam Smith saw, writing in 1776 when his Wealth of Nations was published. It was the incredible, exciting, productive power. And there were, in fact, modern marvels. If you watch that show, Modern Marvels, this is kind of like unbelievable. We can build the Empire State Building. These are the looms, steam-driven looms. And this was like a vision that no one had ever seen before. A giant shed that would go for hundreds of yards, as far away as you could see, full of looms and people working these looms, and miles of cotton thread going in, and then out on the other side comes miles and miles of textiles. Nobody'd seen nothing like this. These were modern marvels. Compared to, say, working in pig slop on the farm, rolling around in the mud, birthing cattle. I used to ride cattle back in the day, where you're wet and muddy and filthy most of the day. Working coal, that's an ugly, dirty business. This is clean, and it looks pristine. And when we say modern, that's what we mean. This is like an antiseptic work environment, and the women are in their, uniforms with their aprons, tending these machines. Here's the bobbins feeding off the threads going into the loom. Of course, there has to be an old white guy managing everything because, well, that's how the world works, right? The problem was that it wasn't all beautiful, right? It wasn't all ideal. As soon as we started to do industrialization, there starts to be side effects, unintended consequences of doing industrialization. Peasants were moved off the land and into the factories, and that's great until winter comes around. Farmers stop buying plows. When farmers stop buying plows, what do the factories do? They shut down. Right? Now the workers are out in the cold in the middle of winter, right? And this kind of employment exploitation where workers could be laid off at the drop of a hat in the middle of winter and didn't have land to go back to, what happens? Very inconvenient. They walk out into the middle of the street and they starve to death, or they freeze to death right there where everybody could see them. Now, back into time immemorial, millions of peasants have been dying. Every famine, every drought, peasants would just die and nobody knew it. They weren't uncounted, literally. We didn't start doing birth certificates and counting people until this modern period. It's Gutenberg with all the records and everything. Then we get obsessed with counting everybody and all the births and all the deaths and the census kind of thing. Before that, we just never knew. Millions of people would die and we just didn't know. Now they're dying right in our face. And this kind of industrialization is very visible. You have these urban shanty towns, no sewage, no sewer system. They would just take the slop buckets and pour them out the window, and the sewage would flow right down the middle of the street. Well, there's no real street. It's just a dirt path, really. And so you get immediate urban blight, like almost week 2 of the Industrial Revolution. You also see in the newspapers, week 2 of the Industrial Revolution, people writing to the newspapers complaining about all those foreigners coming to take our jobs. We're talking 1820. As soon as you open up the factories and as soon as there's labor, those other darn Europeans are coming to take our jobs in our factories. So the movement of labor to where the work is, that's in the system and has been from the very beginning. Actually, this tracks into the colonial period. Labor has flowed to work for 400 years of this capital process. Well, it becomes really in your face clear when it becomes industrial capitalism because it's urban, right? It's happening where everyone can see it. And the workers at this time weren't just regular workers. Those women they showed you, one of the benefits of being a worker early on was that you could bring your kids to work. Remember, you don't have the farmhouse anymore. There's no daycare. There's no schools. There's no social infrastructure. There's no retirement programs. There's no health care. And so the parents, particularly the mothers, were allowed to bring their children into the factories. And the kids would work in the factories. And when they get laid off, the kids get laid off. And so this was men, women, and children that would get laid off and starve to death in an urban environment. And so we start to see traffic congestion, taxis. Taxis were just horse-drawn carriages that had a little meter tied to the wheel. That was a taxi. And you would have to take the carriage from this point to that point, and it would count how many times the wheel turned, and you would pay according to that. But you start to see this incredible urbanization and a massive congestion and pollution, and you start to get immigrants and subcultures and all those things that we think of as urban blight. They're happening real time when this thing kicks off. At the same time, all of these workers become entirely dependent on the market. And it might be the company store. Okay? But you don't have any farmland. You're not growing your own carrots and squash and potatoes. You're not raising chickens anymore. All your food has to come from the store. So when we say this is a huge transition, this is a transition from being a relatively independent farm person capable of growing your own food and making your own clothes and tanning your own hides to someone that's entirely dependent on work and on being able to consume all their goods in the marketplace. We're a different animal after this transition. The last time this kind of transition happened was 10,000 years ago when we went from hunter-gatherer to agricultural sedentary lifestyle. For 10,000 years, we live in small villages doing agriculture, and then this change happens. It's about 10,000 years since the last time we had this kind of transition on us. And we start to see pollution and resource consumption. What happens around a factory? All the trees get cut right away. All that wood's needed to build the factory. Where do we put all of the pollutants coming out of the factory? And we dump them in the stream. Some of the streams got so bad, there's an event in London called the Great Stink, when the Thames got so foul that parts of it actually caught fire. This is not normal. Rivers don't normally catch fire. But you can get so much oil and so much pollution in them that they become flammable, right? But you can see the devastation with all of these humans and all the human waste and all the trash and the output. It just destroys the immediate area almost instantly. And in this period, this is an immigrant tenement. What you did was you had the factory downstairs. And the cheapest place to put the workers? In the 5 floors above. And what did the owners do? They'd lock the doors so that the workers, particularly the women, you don't want them out at night, right? And so you'd have the factory down below and everybody locked in above. What happens?
Fire.
Factory burns and all the workers with it. Very common. This is still actually happens, that people can't get out of burning buildings because some employer found it cost effective to chain that door. You see it in nightclubs. This is still making the news. But this was an abject form of poverty, this urbanized sort of cheap housing. It's part of the capitalist system from the very beginning. And we always, from the beginning, love to hate on those immigrant communities coming in. And we have the idealized image of the factory, but in English, you'll still hear children sometimes referred to as bobbins, lovely little bobbins, because they manned the bobbins. And this was extremely dangerous work with big loom machinery over their heads going back and forth. And all these little spools of cotton had to be replaced. And the kids were an effective labor force for this. They could crawl under the machinery and get to the bobbins. And sure, occasionally one of the little blighters would get sucked into the machinery. One of my first cases as an EMT was a worker that got sucked into a sawmill. There wasn't a lot left when you get sucked into a piece of machinery like that. But these kids were dying very frequently. It was dangerous work for adults. The machines were not well designed. Worker safety wasn't an issue. The adults were dying. The kids were dying right and left. They weren't well nourished in the first place. People weren't getting a lot of rest, a lot of sleep. When you're working a 16-hour day, stuff would happen and children would die. And so it really wasn't until the 1900s that these specific images, an expose on child labor, helped to push child labor laws. But this is what the Industrial Revolution looked like. It was very poor, very dirty, and involved a lot of children. We talked a little bit about the overcrowding. They couldn't pack the workers in tight enough. These buildings would be multi-story, very small apartments, one shared bathroom, often out back in the outhouse. And the coal smoke. So some of our earliest environmental laws go back into the 1600s. What people would do is they would collect coal at the beach. And these big, huge coal seams that are underground actually at the shoreline become exposed where the sea's eroding away the shore. And they would pick up this low-grade coal called sea coal and burn it to try and keep warm. And because it was low grade, it had a ton of sulfur. What happens when you burn sulfur? It goes up into the air and it makes sulfuric acid, acid rain. But when the smoke from this cheap coal gets together with fog, there are certain places where you have inversion layers, like LA does this, where the air on the bottom gets warm and all the outside air is really cool in comparison. It makes a warm air pocket. Mexico City does this. It's in a high mountain valley. When you fly into Mexico City, usually your plane will hit this incredible bump. And what you're doing is transitioning from the normal air to the city air, which is much warmer, and it's a pocket of foul city air, right? A lot of these places are in valleys, and they're creating sulfuric, air. And the coal dust was so thick in these areas that the white moths started to naturally select, and they became dark moths. They would breed to black moths because the birds could see the white moths too easily. And the black moths were camouflaged. And so you would actually see, adaptation to the coal dust that was so thick around places like London. And the human cost of this was intense. It was all driven by coal mining, which was very dangerous. You get black lung cancer from breathing in all the particulate in the mines. And who fits down in the mines really well? Children. So you'd have the big equipment and the men running the big equipment, but who gets into all the nooks and crannies? And what happens is you go down in the mine and you might not come back up until Friday. You can spend days in there. In the American South with slave labor, some of those slave mine workers never did come back up again. When they came back up again, it was to be buried in the giant cemeteries around the coal mines. Many of those cemeteries have just been rediscovered, right? But you could, in this world, go underground and not come back up again for weeks or years, and in certain documented cases, decades, where they never saw the light of sun again. Of course, these kids had a very short lifespan. It was very dangerous. Right at this moment, along comes Karl Marx. And Karl Marx hears about the industrial miracle in England, and he wants to know about this industrial miracle. You're smiling because you know how this story goes, right? And he wants to see the miracle of industrialization. And so he shows up, and what does he find? Those incredible idealistic images that, say, Adam Smith had drawn of the ideal potential of capitalism. No, we're talking 70, 80 years later when all these side effects, all these nasty, features of capitalism were all too obvious. And what Marx walks into looks like a living hell for him. He sees it as massive exploitation, right? The slums, the choking stench of human feces and coal smoke, the mass exploitation without any social safety net. People became too old to work, you fire them. They starve to death. No, it's not my business as a businessman. He can't work, I can't pay him. Let the old folks die. There was no social security, right? Whole families would get laid off and die. And this has been a feature of industrialization since the beginning. When the factories start to cut work orders, when consumers, farmers stop buying, plows, the factories shut down. The more factories shut down, the fewer people can afford to buy cars and plows and refrigerators, and so more factories shut down. And the thing goes into a complete spiral. And the more layoffs, the fewer people can buy things, the fewer people that can buy it, and the next thing you know, you're in a deep recession or even going into a depression. For no particular reason other than people stop buying things or people stop producing things because people stop buying things, and it's hard to tell where it started. Consumer confidence, that's why that matters. If consumers stop buying clothes and cars and refrigerators, the whole thing goes in the toilet, right? For no reason that anybody can point at necessarily. Sometimes there's a trigger. Sometimes we don't know why. It just took a downturn and everyone lost confidence. And the economy does. So the whole history of this kind of capitalism is boom and bust. When was the first bank bailout? I've seen two in my lifetime. 2008 was a big one, the savings and loan one before that. But we have had huge crashes and bank bailouts cyclically every 10 to 20 years since the 1600s. The first time U.S. banks were bailed out, we were still a colony. It wasn't even the United States yet. But was boom and bust cycle is part of the whole thing. So Karl Marx comes in and he sees abject poverty and cruel exploitation, like murderous exploitation that's killing people, right? But Adam Smith saw bounty. And this is the first moment in history when we can clothe everyone and feed everyone. How could their worldviews or their understandings of capitalism be so different? Well, one explanation is they're about 70 years apart, right? So now you get Professor McCarty's famous fruit smoothie example. You got to remember, I started doing this before there was Jamba Juice and, blenders in the grass and all these smoothie stores running around. But let's say, imagine you're really good at making fruit smoothies. You get the bananas and maybe some yogurt or some fruit juice in there and some strawberries or whatever, and you make really good fruit smoothies. And you're impressed, and you tell your friends, oh, try this fruit smoothie, and they're amazed. They love it. And the next thing you know, your friends are like all on the couch saying, yeah, can you make me one of those? You're like, yeah, I can make you one of my fruit smoothies. At least for the first few times, you're like, yeah, no problem. After a while, you start to think, shouldn't you be making your own fruit smoothie, you lazy bum? Get off the couch. Make your own fruit smoothie. But then one of your lazy-ass friends makes a horrible mistake and says, you should be selling these. You should go into business making fruit smoothies. And you think, yeah, you lazy ass. I should charge people for these. I'm paying a lot of money for the bananas and the yogurt and the fruit juice and all of those strawberries. And it takes time to make this stuff. And you guys should ought to be paying me for this. You're out of here. I'm going into business. You kick all your lazy friends out and you go into business. And you're really successful because you're good at this. And the next thing you know, you're the fruit smoothie artist. And you're walking around town and people are going, oh, hey, look, there's the fruit smoothie artist. That's the person that makes the really good fruit smoothies. And you should go and try their fruit smoothies because they're the best in town. And this is how life used to be. When you grew your products and you took it to the market, you would trade your goods with people that you knew. And this was your position in society. You were the farmer or the tinker or the tailor. This was your role. And the people you lived with knew to come to you. What's a tinker do? Anybody know what the tinker does?
They fix things.
They fix mostly pots and pans. So they're pounding to try and get your pots and pans back into shape. Tink, 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 tink. That's a tinker. Or the cobbler to make your shoes. And everybody had their favorite cobbler, right? Make the kind of shoes you want to wear. I like those thigh-high black boots myself with short shorts. I look hot in those. But this is the thing. As a fruit smoothie artist, this becomes your livelihood and your relationship to the community. It's your role. This is how you make a living. And your reputation depends on this, right? It isn't just nice to have a people liking me. Everybody likes all the attention, right? That's why I became a teacher. I like all this attention, right? But this is how you make your living, and your living depends on it. You can't serve up a bad smoothie. You can't have someone get food poisoning from your smoothie. This can wreck your business. You can go broke on this, right? So your reputation is everything, right? Your whole position in society. This is why I use the word artist. You're an artisan. You're an artisan like the silversmith was an artisan. Or, the cartwright was an artisan that's proud of their work. Right? But this is how we got to where everybody's named, Gates. We talk about Bill Gates. Where did he get his name? Because he was the gatekeeper, the gates keeper, right? That's where that name comes from. Thatcher, really common, like Margaret Thatcher. These are the people that thatched your roof, right? There's the Skinner, Cooper. Cooper's the guy that puts the hoops on the barrels. That's what a Cooper is. Lots of Coopers around, right? Carter, Cartwright. Here's Harry Potter. You wanted to know where Harry Potter was? There he is up there. Mason, super common name. You switch over to German, you get Zuckerman. Schindler was the guy that put the shingles on your roof. One of my fellow faculty members was named Frühstück, Austrian. Just meant breakfast. Sounds a lot better in Austrian, Frühstück, right? But you can switch languages and do this in Spanish and do this, and you get millions of names. Wagner. At some point, Wagner's relatives were making wagons because he was the wagoner. That's who Wagner was. You can switch over to Hebrew, lots of names. Cohen, right? But this would have been the priest. You can just keep switching languages and get all the family names on this. When I mean this is your position in society, I'm not kidding, right? So now you're the fruit smoothie artist, right? What happens when you hire an employee? Let's say I'm getting too busy and I need help. I need help making fruit smoothies. If I hire an employee, are they going to care about my business the way I do? How do we know that?
Why should they?
Why should they? That doesn't really answer the question. How do I know this? Because everywhere I go, it's college students serving me. I can't go to any restaurant, but it's one of you waiting a table. I try to order a scotch on the rocks, and it's one of you bartending everywhere I go. I go into Jamba Juice or Blenders in the Grass or somewhere, and I say, excuse me, I'd like a, and what do you guys do? Give me the finger, because you're too busy texting. I'm like, I want some service. I'm the customer here. Did you care about your first job? I'll date myself here. My first job was at a place called Orange Julius. That's how old I am. Anyone ever seen an Orange Julius? They still have them around. There's a few, sort of like A&W restaurants. The root beer place used to have restaurants, but it was orange juice, and so it's like an orange cream drink with lots of oranges. Cutting oranges was my first job. But I used to have that poster that said I'd quit this job, except for it's the only place I get any sleep. As an employee, mostly, you're just working for a wage. You have to stand there for a certain number of hours, and you're getting paid by the hour. The example I use here is my daughter, my poor kids. They get used in this class all the time. But my daughter went off to college, thankfully, managed to go to college. And she had to come back home and work in the summer. That was the deal. You couldn't just totally mooch all summer long. You had to work. So we went to a temp agency, got one of these jobs in an office, went to work. This was when I was at Santa Barbara, UC Santa Barbara. And she comes home and I say, where are you working at? She names the company and I'm like, what do they do? And she says, I don't know. She had no idea what the company produced or if it produced anything. Like, is it insurance? Is it, banking? Is it real estate? What? Santa Barbara's not a huge manufacturing town, sort of more tourist town, right? Well, it turns out Santa Barbara is the largest manufacturer, two of the largest manufacturers of what are in Santa Barbara, California? Nobody knows. I didn't know. Breast implants. The two biggest producers of silicone breast implants are in Santa Barbara, and my daughter ends up working for one of them. And so I send her off to work. I said, find out what your company makes. You should at least know what your company makes. She comes back and says, look, Dad, breast implants. I'm like, oh, great. She's Division I soccer player, right? These are great, Dad, she says, for ice packs. You put the breast implants in the freezer, and then you can put them on your knees and things. And so I spent 2 full summers with my freezer full of breast implants because my Division I soccer player daughter was working at this breast implant company. But she didn't even know what they produced. That's how far we've come from being the producer itself. So the employees often don't know, don't care what the employer is actually producing. They're just wheels in a, cog in a wheel. I just do this. I shuffle this paper from this place to this place, right? That's all I do. So when you hire someone by the hour to become a wage laborer instead of an artisan, they become what Marx said was alienated from the product. Their identity isn't tied up with the fruit smoothie. This person I've hired to help me, sort of a half-wit that's really more on the phone than they are at work, a teenager who can barely feed themselves anyway and is more worried about the cuties walking around the mall than whatever job I might put in front of them, right? They don't care, and I know they don't care. Can I pay, let's say on my fruit smoothies I sell for $5. Can I pay my employee $5 a smoothie to make it? No? Why not? I would have no profit. The worker doesn't work like I do, doesn't care like I do. There ain't no way I'm paying him $5 a smoothie. And I couldn't if I wanted to. I cannot pay an employee what their work is worth. By definition, in the capitalist system, my profit depends on paying that worker less than their work is worth. Nobody disputes this. Not the liberal economists, not the Marxists, nobody. This is how the system has always worked. I would be insane to pay this worker what their labor is worth, because I would have no profit. I would go out of business. Okay? Plus, I got a pad for the days that they're there. Sometimes sales are up, sometimes sales are down, sometimes the bananas and the strawberries cost more or less, and so I have to pay the worker down near the bottom of whatever that is so that I got margins. Some days I get a lot of customers, some days I don't get a lot of customers. And the next thing you know, it becomes really easy to just pay that worker as little as I can. That's the safe thing to do. Whatever the minimum is, that's what I'm paying them. If there happens to be lots of money, I could bonus them later or something, right? But paying the worker makes more sense, paying them as little as we can. And so Marx said the ideology comes in and makes everything appear as not as what they are. All of a sudden it appears like the employer is doing you a favor by hiring you and is paying you for your hours. That's not actually what they're paying you for. But it seems like they're paying you, what, $10 an hour is the minimum wage now? 13. At least I'm glad at least one of you works. I mean, everybody else is like, I don't know, I could ask my mom and dad because I don't work. Right? But they're making it seem as if you're being paid a fair amount for your hours. You think you're in a trade, hours for money, which is not exactly what's going on here, right? So what they try to do is incent you to work harder without paying you more. What are some of the ways that employers get you to work harder without paying you more? Yeah, everybody could pay a bonus or something, but I'm talking about specifically about unpaid motivation.
Employee of the month.
Employee of the month, otherwise known as chump of the month, right? If I was working down there at, Chick-fil-A, I would not want employee of the month. Why? they put your picture up on the wall. Like, oh, employee of the month, picture. There's a whole segment of customers that come in and ask for the employee of the month because they want to test out the service of this particular establishment. Usually a little old lady or something. They were like, I want the chump of the month waiting on me. Employee of the month waiting on me. It's like, oh, forget it. I'll pay you $20 not to make me employee of the month. What other mechanisms do they use to try and motivate you?
Promotion?
Sorry?
Promotion?
Promotion? Sort of. I said without paying you more.
Like opportunity for promotion.
Opportunity for promotion, whether or not you get it or not. You go to work at McDonald's or Taco Bell or someplace, and the idea is that you're going to be able to make a career out of this. Is there any way to actually sustain a household working at one of these fast food chains?
Without being like the manager?
What does it cost to maintain an apartment in Orange County? Current estimate to maintain a household, not own a home, but in an apartment.
I know in Irvine the average is about $2,300.
You're just talking rent.
Yeah.
Income that you have to have. Sorry?
You have to think about
Food, parking, insurance.
80,000?
About 80,000. It just went over 80,000 is the estimated income that you would need. Are you going to make 80,000 working at Chick-fil-A? Not ever going to happen. My younger daughter's got a job at one of these fruit smoothie places, a bonsai bowl in Laguna, right? They're talking to her about her career. There is no career there. Turnover's like 300%, people coming and going. You would not want to be a manager in one of these places. It's more work than you ever dreamed of. So they want to make you think that there's career advancement. And they'll give you a promotion and they'll make you assistant French fry operator. Seriously. And if you're really good and you stay at that for 5 years, then you can become chief assistant French fry operator. And that comes with 15 cents an hour increase. I did this, I was at McDonnell Douglas, like 4 doors down from the president. And I'd put up a sign on my door that said, Chief Executive Scapegoat. And like within 2 days, they made me take it down. But I felt like that was my real job, Chief Executive Scapegoat. But they'll give you titles, but they're not going to give you money. The one that I really like is the Employee of the Month parking space. I am not sure why people will actually kill each other for that parking space right up front. But it is amazing what people will do to get the special Chump of the Month parking place right up front.
I think another thing employers do is they try to convince you that they're all a family.
Key word. We're all a family here. We're one big happy family here at Chick-fil-A. Until I lay your ass off. And by the way, you're fired, family. Brother, it's been nice knowing you. You're out. Right? But no, you would never ask your mom or your dad for a raise. Heavens no. So they're using everything in the world, all the smoke and the mirrors to try and get you to do more work because you're alienated from the product in the first place. If you're the fruit smoothie artist, nobody has to make you care. But all these mechanisms are in place to try and make you care about your work. And you don't even think about it. If you're working for yourself or you're an artist or you're like me, a professional, how did I end up being a teacher? Did I get into this because I want to make a lot of money? Trust me, that ain't it. Teachers don't get paid a lot. I was lecturing people on the city bus. I once got a standing ovation on a city bus, lecturing in geology, which is not even my topic. And finally somebody said, you never shut up. You might as well go be a teacher because you're teaching all the time anyway. And so I came and I started teaching. right? Because it's my passion and I care about this. I care about teaching you guys, right? I'm not here thinking, oh gosh, I might become the chief assistant French fry operator in 10 years if I work really hard, right? So this process makes wage labor seem like a fair trade, right? What happens when I open another fruit smoothie place across town? Now I got to hire a manager whose job it is to yell at the teenagers they hire to try and make them care about their work. And I create a whole new class of people called managers who's supposed to look out for my interest as the business owner and get the workers to do a lot more work for artificial titles and things. And what happens to my relationship with the customers? All of a sudden, those customers over there don't know who I am unless I get on television and do an obnoxious ad saying, "Hi, I'm Phil the smoothie guy. You should come down and try our smoothies because they're the best." Right? But I have no face-to-face relationship. So what Marx is arguing is that all of our relationships get broken. My relationship to what I'm producing gets broken. My relationship to my community gets broken. I don't even no longer know who's buying my product. I'm no longer trading my carrots for somebody else's zucchini in a market of people that I know, right? And so everything becomes commodified. That's Marx's critique of capitalism. Nothing is what it looks like. It's all about exploitation, right? And everything's become commodified. So I'm going to skip past this. We're not going to go there. But which view is the right view? Is Adam Smith right that this is the most creative and productive system in the history of the world? Or is it Karl Marx that this is the most exploitative, heartless, destructive system the world has ever known? Which is it? We know, Dr. McCarty, that if we wait long enough, you'll answer the question. No, I'm not. Come on.
I do not agree with Smith. I would lean more towards Marx, you know?
Where's the but?
Yeah.
What was that?
I was gonna say, where's the but? Like he sounded like he was gonna say.
Where's the but? Yeah. Do we want to agree with either one of them?
Yes.
Oh, the Marx. We got the Marxists over here. Marx was totally wrong. We want to dig him up and hang him. We're like, socialism's terrible, communism's terrible, but he understood something about the system, something that we don't like to face very often. Which system is it? It depends on where you are in the system. If you're Professor McCarty and you have a home in Southern California overlooking the California coast and a gigantic margarita in your right hand, the system looks pretty stinking good. Because I'm on the receiving end. All that produce, all that energy, that all comes to me. It fills up my glass and it tastes nice and cool with that hint of lime and really good tequila. Cazadores, because I'm a traditionalist, right? Always got to have the Cazadores. If I'm in Mozambique, what does capitalism look like?
A death sentence.
A death sentence. It looks like 1800s England. There's no infrastructure. There's no streets. It's shanty towns. There's no sewer system. There's no retirement. There's no government that you can count on. Right? It's poverty, it's overcrowding, it's unhealthy. That's what capitalism looks like. So it depends on where you are in the system as to whether you think it's all Adam Smith or all Karl Marx. The Industrial Revolution didn't come to an end. Right now, the Industrial Revolution is impacting more people, vastly more people, right now than it ever did. I'm not talking about a couple 100 million Northern Europeans. I'm talking billions, 4, 5, 6 billion people being impacted by this revolution. And most of them aren't in the margarita place, where I promise you I will be no more than 6 hours from now. Go away, think about that. I got places to go. We'll see you.